I'm Adrian Flannelly, and I was born and bred in County Mayo in Ireland. To narrow it down a little bit more, in the parish of Attimass. And there is a very strong connection between Attimass and New York. There has always been, but frankly, the connection that I'm very proud of is that the Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park City was transported stone by stone from my home parish. A neighbouring village of Carricastle. Carricastle is where I was born, Carricastle House. And the very next village over, there was the house, the rocks, the land that is transported to Battery Park City. Brings me back to that parish of Attimass, which was the first parish on the island of Ireland to report death from starvation. To describe Attimass is to describe a lovely scenic parish. It's stuck over on the side of the Ox Mountains in County Mayo. Rugged, pretty beautiful, perfect setting for poverty. And it was in 1845 that it became obvious that something was terribly wrong, not only in our parish and primarily in the west of Ireland. A blight which at the time was accepted as a God-given, a scourge from on high. It devastated the potato crop. Normally, that might have been, on its own, that would have been a tragedy, but considering that the Irish, at that time, the Irish farmers, those in rural Ireland, that was their total diet, that was their total food intake. You know, 1 million died, 1 million emigrated, 1 million were, and to this day are, unaccounted for. The number of lives lost at sea is still only a guesstimate. The immigration from Ireland due to the Irish famine. Basically, people were fleeing. They were fleeing to just about any place that they felt they would receive some kind of welcome. Unfortunately, they would not be welcome, nor could they flee famine. And you could almost swim across to Britain, to Wales, to England. Those in Northern Ireland could actually see Scotland from the north on a clear day, but that wasn't an option. Which brings us to, you know, a topic that we would not have been free to talk about in the parish of Attimass, or in County Mayo, or in Connacht, or in many of the areas throughout Ireland, primarily the coastal areas, where poverty and where the horrific great hunger struck the worst. You know, we talk about unaccounted for. We still haven't been able to count not the odd one, but the hundreds and the thousands who actually died on the side of the road. Many of them were found dead or almost dead, eating the only thing that they could indeed that they could find. And if you want to kind of get some kind of perspective on this, imagine dying from starvation, terribly weak, being riddled with vomit and dysentery, and eating grass because that was the only thing available. The horrific, the great hunger, the famine, as we knew about it and only vaguely, the famine actually started in 1845, and it lasted until 1852. Now we speak mostly as the famine which began in 1847. No, 1847 was when it was obvious to those who somehow were trying to survive for those couple of years, and indeed some only felt the effects of it in 1847. It is known as Black 47. Black 47 because of the blight on the potato. Black because it was indeed significantly dark days. It was the end of lives for so many people. Many who had emigrated, and those were the lucky ones, had no intention, no idea of emigrating. You have to bear in mind that part of the plan, part of the MO of the British Empire at the time, was to ensure that that the Irish, that they were, for all intents and purposes, they were slaves. Their one and only job was to work the fields, ensure that Britain would have such a resourceful supply of corn, of wheat, of barley, not only for the British themselves, but they were, of course, traders. They were a lot of that of their exports from Ireland, which incidentally, obviously, they had ruled. We refer to the 800 years of British oppression. Well, then we were talking about 700 years, but it was the fate of the Irish in their own country to be under foreign rule, to be under that, and to be, for all intents and purposes, nothing short of slaves, of slavery. That's what we were. Ireland was ruled from Britain, from England, and they were ruled by absentee landlords. Landlords who would have gotten sections, parishes, areas, many of them undefined, as rewards. Indeed, many of them were lords, many of them had great political contacts, many of them many of the landlords who got these sections of Ireland, we find later on, never bothered visiting Ireland, visiting the area where they had received this enormous gift.
Well, you call it slavery, which it was. Isn't it in a certain way almost worse than American slavery? The American plantation owners did not allow their slaves to die of starvation. Weren't the British basically responsible? I mean, the difference between a famine and a hunger, right? The Irish community calls it a hunger. You know, isn't that a political distinction? The fact that it's a hunger because it could have been alleviated, but it wasn't. I mean, if this had happened in Britain, if there had been this crop failure in Britain, I'm saying they would not have allowed their own citizens to have this fate, right?
No.
So you're saying that the current good state of relationship between the British and the Irish is part of the way that the Irish community now views the Great Hunger? In other words, are you saying that, you know, because you have good relations now, you're not trying to be too hard on that part of British Irish history?
No, I'm not saying that. I think what has happened, though, is that the Great Irish Hunger, we accept the British and the British politicians, the British royalty accept as being a horrific period. Official apologies have been made by prime ministers in Britain for, you know, the horrific handling of the famine, of the Great Irish Hunger. Again, when we say Great Irish Hunger, that's much more acceptable here. There are references to the Irish famine still in Ireland and definitely in Britain. But I'd like to back up to why we would not have spoken much or in hushed tones, and definitely why children growing up in Ireland would not have heard much, if anything, about the famine. You take the parish of Attimass, my parish. Somehow in the decade beginning in 1845, in that next decade, 3/4 of the inhabitants of Attimass parish were no longer there. Most of them died from starvation. Take again, and I have to repeat, the tragedy of those unaccounted for, and the lucky ones were the immigrants, those who were left in the parish. Those were, again, survivors. It became very, even in the subconscious, we became very aware that surviving this horrific tragedy that we still had to accept as being an act of God. Nobody was telling us that all of this could have been prevented. Not some of it, all of it could have been prevented. It could have been prevented by some recognition by Britain that in fact, if people were starving to death, maybe for a couple of years not exporting the food, plenty of it, in Ireland might have been able to rectify. It didn't take any huge decision making. It didn't take an act of Parliament. If there had been a recognition, if there had been if the reality of people starving in Ireland, if that had been acknowledged, then we wouldn't be talking about the Great Irish Hunger.
Well, I obviously I can't approach it from someone Irish and that experience, but from someone who's not Irish, it just seems to me, and not all tremendously knowledgeable, it does seem to me that you can make the case that at the highest levels of the British government, they knew exactly what was going on, and they chose not to take action. I mean, was it from me as someone who's non-Irish, I'm saying, was this simply a matter of, this is sad what's happening, it's too bad, there was the crop failure, it's, as say, an act of God and we can't do it. I mean, it seemed the British, the most powerful empire in the world, was in a position to stop what resulted from the crop failure, but they chose not to. I mean, isn't that I'm looking at it potentially, as you could see this, as a very conscious decision on the part of the British leadership to let, how many people died as a result of the famine approximately?
We're talking about 2 million.
All right.
2 million that, again...
then there may be more. So I'm wondering, and it seems to me like this was a conscious decision on the part of the powerful part of the British leadership to allow 2 or 3 million people to die. But, I mean, is that not the case? I mean, is it really something that they did not have enough power, enough control, enough resources to stop this if they truly wanted to?
Well, they could have stopped it. Is it, if there's an area of doubt, it would be, it would come under neglect, interest. Again, bear in mind that the absentee landlords never had much interest in the first place. And you also have to bear in mind the reality that the Irish, who at the best of times were fighting for survival, the restrictions on allowing the Irish to actually fend for themselves, that had been blocked.
Even if the crop failure hadn't happened, things were terrible in Ireland anyway. They were on the cusp of disastrous conditions. People just barely survived anyway.
Right.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that it wasn't just the famine. It was the famine was the crop failure sort of took it over the edge. But the Irish people lived in terrible conditions for the longest time anyway. And had they not, the crop failure would not have had the same impact.
They were living in horrible conditions, and of course there had been immigration before the famine, Great Hunger.
A curious question I have in terms of the hunger as a defining moment, since the result was 2 to 3 million dead, and I don't want to use this in an incorrect way, but the Jewish people see obviously the Holocaust as a defining moment because the actions of the Germans clearly resulted in the decimation of the European Jewish community. I mean, although that involved putting people into these horrible ovens, but could someone make the case that there is more in common between what happened to the Irish under British rule as happened to the Jews under German rule? Is there a conceivably somewhat of a commonality of impact here, and is the hunger as much of a defining element for I guess it doesn't seem to be quite as defining an element in Irish history, not to the extent that the Holocaust is. I mean, the other interesting thing you brought out when you started out by talking about hunger is still terrible in the world. I would think that if the general consensus was that the death through famine of millions of Irish was as horrible as I mean, no one's going to let the Holocaust happen again, all right? One would think that there would be more emphasis on hunger today if, in fact, the general public had the same view of the famine or the hunger as they did have of the Holocaust. People would say, they would say never again for something like people being herded into ovens. I'm wondering that, from your point of view, and mine too, that hunger is still a terrible condition, that actually there more awareness of what happened in a very negative way might be having a positive impact today.
To compare the famine, the reaction to the famine with the Holocaust, we're not comfortable in discussing that aspect of it. But there was somewhat some similarities. The famine came, there was no war. It was generally accepted that, particularly in rural Ireland, that because of the oppression and because the British and definitely the British government had perceived that, in fact, since they ruled Ireland and had for hundreds of years, that it was pretty much in their domain to make the decisions with respect to Ireland. Some people outside of the serfs, the slaves, those in rural Ireland, there were Irish people who did quite well. There were Irish people who, in fact, themselves ignored this tremendous devastation. Of course, there were Irish people who had voluntarily emigrated to the British Empire because they were of a higher standing. There were British people who had actually intermarried with the Irish. But then you could apply that just to about any ethnic group you could have.
But would you say that whatever there was, you would have called Irish leadership, that their own actions or inactions were a factor? That there was an element in the Irish community that played a negative role in the hunger?
Well, first of all, I'd have to point out that there weren't Irish leaders, there were British leaders.
So there wasn't any real Irish leadership in those days?
No.
All right, okay. But there were a couple of wealthy Irish people, is what you're saying?
There would have been.
But there wasn't really a leadership?
There would have been, no. There was the leadership.
There wasn't a leadership that could have challenged the British to do more as a group. There was no such thing at that point, okay.
No. The victims of the famine. You may notice that I have to switch from the Great Hunger when I'm here, in sitting within walking distance of the Irish Hunger Memorial. Since I'm speaking to and with the Lower Manhattan Historical Society, since I am in an area that indeed knew more about the Irish, the hunger, the famine, than practically any place on earth. Those who made it, those who actually did not die at sea, those who came to New York, They arrived here somehow within walking distance of the current Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park City. This was the new land. Many had no idea what they were coming to. But whatever they were coming to had to be a lot better than the starvation and the stigma. If you want to talk about a living stigma, you'd have to go back to that period, you'd have to go back to that parish, my own parish, and I use that as a symbol for, and one that I'm aware of. If your cousins, your aunts, your uncles lived across the road, and if the famine and if the disease had struck that house, you could no longer visit, you could no longer have anything to do with them. If you saw a relative, if you saw your neighbor struggling, dying from starvation, the option was not there to see if you could help them.
So the hunger created Irish America also. There's one of the results of the hunger, right? There never been, had the Irish people not been oppressed the way they were generally by the British, and had the crop failures not happened, there never would have been the kind of immigration to America that occurred.
Not the kind of immigration. There had been immigration, obviously, to America for, since
the start.
America,
Right, since the
start,
1600s,
since America.
Since New Amsterdam.
Yeah, but no, this was different.
But the Irish have become a very significant part of the United States over the last century and a half or so, and I guess the numbers would not have been, the impact, the breadth of Irish society would not have come here in the same amount had it not been for those conditions.
Absolutely not. Irish America as we know it today is, depending, could be a gift to America, could be a gift to the Irish, but it was a haven and still is.